This week on Worldview, COVID, Myanmar, Afghanistan, can the UN system really recover from this year of failures? Hello and welcome to Worldview at the Hindu with me, Suhasini Haidar.
This resolution says to the Taliban, actions speak louder than words. You've made these promises, these commitments. Now you've got to uphold them.
Now, September is called UN month, and that's because the UN General Assembly of 193 countries in the world meets every September. This year, it will begin on September the 14th, and then for a few weeks, you will hear from all the world leaders as they address the body. Now, there is much to dwell on in the past year, but three issues where the UN system appears to have failed quite visibly stand out, and that is the fight against COVID, the coup in Myanmar, and now the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. So let's just take each of these issues apart and talk about why the UN system seems to have failed. To begin with, there's the fight against COVID, and this is something we've dealt with in previous editions of Worldview. The WHO failed to see the problem coming, failed to stop the spread of the virus. The UN Security Council then failed to hold China accountable for its actions, for not telling the world about the spread of the virus. Even as China did its own travel restrictions, it didn't tell the world about what to expect. WHO teams, in fact, have not been able to conclude or make a conclusion on the origins of the virus so far, particularly because they have not gained access to Chinese laboratories, particularly in Wuhan. Then you see the UN systems failing really to ensure that the Western world, US, Western countries are pushing for the equitable distribution of vaccines. They aren't, it isn't that they are not sharing them, but they are not willing to share them on a scale where the entire world has access. Even after the WTO, where there was an appeal by India and South Africa, we haven't seen the world really, the Western world rallying around that appeal. And as a result, there in the first world, if you like, in the developed world, you have people taking third shots and booster shots, whereas in the developing or the third world, really people are still waiting for access to that first shot. As a result, we see a situation where there are 4 million people dead, fear of more variants of the virus, and no one yet held responsible. So let's turn then to the next issue, which is Myanmar. And in February, we saw the Myanmar military, what is called the junta now, is really taking over power, putting the leaders who were democratically elected just a few months ago into prison, slapping them with national security cases and declaring a full emergency. Since February, the UN Security Council has held about 3 discussions, but it's taken really no action against the Myanmar junta for the coup, as well as putting people in jail. And remember, Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi is amongst those. No new sanctions have been announced, really, nor any punitive actions, and we'll explain why that is. No United Nations push for the release of those democratically elected leaders. And remember, it's been months now. And it comes on the back of an already unresolved situation with the Rohingya refugees, about 1 million in refugee camps in Bangladesh still, years after the ethnocide there. Countless missions by the United Nations, including the Kofi Annan report that spoke of genocide in Myanmar, and yet we see no action by the United Nations. And we had seen this in the past. The third is, of course, the more current issue everyone is talking about, and that's Afghanistan. Now, in August itself, and remember, India was the president of the UN Security Council in August, so there was a greater impetus for the region, really, to take action. In that case, we saw 3 discussions of the UN Security Council. We saw 1 resolution in which 2 members abstained. We'll talk about that, on the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, but not one really contained any binding or punitive language. Each statement, in fact, became a watered-down version of the previous statement. So if on August 3rd, you had the UN Security Council talking about their opposition to the Islamic Emirates of Afghanistan being imposed on the people there, it was taken out after that, especially after the Taliban takeover of Kabul. References to the Taliban in terrorism have been taken out as well. And now we see the resolution 2593 practically showing the Taliban as the default force, ruling force in the country. The UN has also failed to instill any idea or discussion of a UN-led transitional council. So in the formation of the government, the UN has not played a role, as it did, for example, in East Timor, where it ran the transitional council until it handed over after the independence of the country there. So it has no role at present in the government formation talks. The UN Security Council and the UN agencies have also failed to extract specific assurances on democracy, on representation, on human rights, particularly for women, girls, minorities. And finally, no real commitment against terrorism. While there has been a little lip service and talk, it must be remembered that it was the terror attacks in the US on 9/11 in 2001 that led to a unified UN coming together, to the beginning of what was called the global war on terror, and the US strikes that began on Afghanistan after that. Now, 20 years later, in September, in 2021, we see that the situation has really reversed in many ways. The Taliban is back in power. Al-Qaeda and other groups are still in existence in Afghanistan, and according to UN reports, working with the Taliban. And there is a very real worry of a gender crisis, a humanitarian crisis, and a refugee crisis emanating from Afghanistan. So what are the real reasons? Why is it that the UN seems to be so helpless, particularly on issues that are so broad and really do affect the whole world? To begin with, the problem is that the power is in the hands of a few. It is really the power within the Security Council of the permanent 5 members, US, UK, France, Russia, China, that really have the veto. And therefore, since power is concentrated, it is not a broad-based or democratic effort around the world. It does not involve the entire world. The second part is there is a deep polarization between US, UK, France on one side, and Russia and China on the other. And that depolarization is seen every time there is a vote or a debate, or both of these blocks on 2 separate sides. They stop the unity and they stop a lot of resolutions from going through. There's a lack of UN Security Council reform, something India has been demanding to expand the horizons of the UN Security Council. We've spoken about that. There's the failure of sanctions so far, and places like Iran, North Korea, even Myanmar in the past have faced UN sanctions, but it seems over a long period of time that the regimes in power stay powerful, they continue to have access to resources, and it is the poorest and the needy who really suffer the most when a country is put under UN sanctions. Then there is the concept of global conflict fatigue. And really around the world, people are looking at conflict and saying, can we really afford to intervene? Do we want to contribute to operations there or to humanitarian assistance? The fear of more refugees crowding into their countries. And finally, there is the deterrent of failure. And that is from the responsibility to protect principle that was used in Libya in 2011. Eventually, it was seen as a disaster for the country. The countries that intervened with a UN mandate in Libya eventually ended up broadening the responsibility to protect and made it a mandate for regime change. Now, that is something that countries want to avoid. So you see any very strong resolutions facing that kind of pushback now. So does the UN really have any levers? And let's speak specifically about Afghanistan, because that is right now the discussion that we're going to see over the next month in particular. The first really is the lever that the UN has is one of membership. The accreditation committee of the UN General Assembly has to decide by September 14th, when this session begins, who will occupy Afghanistan's seat. There's also a parallel discussion going on about who will occupy Myanmar's seat. So far, it is the previous government, the democratically elected government's nominee, who occupies it. But in Afghanistan, the accreditation committee has several choices. It could suspend the membership of that country, of Afghanistan. It could leave the seat empty. It could allow the previous government of the Ghani government's nominee, Ambassador HXI, to continue to occupy it, or it could accept the new regime's appointee, but give some certain conditions under which it accepts those. So that is one very powerful lever, especially when it seems very clear that the Taliban and its sponsors and backers are all looking for legitimacy, for recognition this time around. The second is through the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA. Its mandate is to be renewed on September 17th this year. It needs to be strengthened, not diluted or wound up, so that UN agencies in Afghanistan are able to function, monitor progress on those key indicators I spoke about, to bring in supplies unhindered, and to be given protection from harm. So this is very important, to make the UNAMA a very strong lever for the United Nations. Then, of course, there is the 1988 Sanctions Committee. It's also called the Taliban Sanctions Committee. India is the chair of that until December 31st. And it needs to review sanctions on travel bans, asset freezes, stopping access to arms. And those sanctions right now are against 135 individuals and 5 entities, all part of the Taliban. Remember, they include many of the men in positions of power today. Abdul Ghani Baradar, who is leading the talks for government formation, Sher Mohammad Stanigzai, who, remember, met Indian Ambassador Deepak Mittal in Doha this week, the first time the Indian government came out and said they were talking to the Taliban, and then Sirajuddin Haqqani and the Haqqani network. And we've spoken about this before. They are really wanted for attacks on Indian embassy and consulates in Afghanistan for several terror attacks and the deaths of many Indians, amongst other attacks they have carried out. Now, the committee has to decide whether to continue those sanctions, to continue exemptions on some of those who have received travel exemptions, or allow more leniency on travels and funds. This is a committee that is meant to meet in mid-September, but it is a very, very powerful tool if the UN wants to have some leverage over the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. Then there are stronger levers that can be used. One of them is, of course, that the UN Security Council could send in UN monitoring or peacekeeping forces to ensure that international assistance, evacuations from Afghanistan, key programs for women and children are not hindered. There's next the responsibility to protect. If the UN Security Council decides that there is an imminent threat to any group of people, it can consider actions under what's called Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. This empowers the UN Security Council to maintain peace in any part of the world. Remember, the real need is for 2 attributes: unity and leadership. And both of those seem to be in short supply when it comes to the UN system at the moment. There's neither unity nor really forceful leadership in a world that is seeing the retrenchment of the United States, the aggressive rise of China, and the success of populism, xenophobia, anti-globalization amongst leaders and forces in the world. It is hard to see the United Nations really, in its current form, rise to its considerable potential. And remember, that potential was envisaged 76 years ago in this charter that was adopted in 1945. And it began with the words, and I will read from that: "We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small." In order to build to that commitment, the United Nations is going to have to reach out and reach up. We have many book recommendations for you on the United Nations in particular. There's the UN Security Council, From the Cold War to the 21st Century. This is by former diplomat David Malone, who also writes about India. There's a much easier book to read by Linda Fasulo called An Insider's Guide to the UN. Really what you need to know about what's going to follow in the month of September. There's the historical book, The Parliament of Man, Past, Present, and Future of the UN by Paul Kennedy. It's now a classic. It's about 15 years old. Then there is The Realizing of Human Rights by Samantha Power and Graham Allison. And remember, Samantha Power was in the Obama administration, is now in the Biden administration, and is a very, very ardent supporter of R2P and for interventions in general. There's the opposite and counter view that came from India, called Perilous Interventions, the Security Council and the Politics of Chaos. This is by a minister in the Indian cabinet, Hardeep Singh Puri, who used to be the ambassador to the United Nations, talking about all the interventions that went wrong. And a newer book called The New World Disorder and the Indian Imperative. This is by Shashi Tharoor, who was, of course, in the UN system as well, and Samir Saran, where they talk about how a new UN body or a new world can be created, world order can be created. So we hope you enjoy reading all those books, and you do join us again here on Worldview from the team here. Thanks for watching.